March 31, 1945. Joseph Stalin sent a message to General Dwight Eisenhower claiming Berlin no longer mattered strategically. The Soviet High Command would send only minor forces toward Germany's capital, he wrote. The Red Army's main attack would start in late May, perhaps even June. Every word was false. While that message was being prepared for the West, two massive military forces were gathering along the Oder River, just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov controlled the first Belarusian front facing the city directly. Marshal Ivan Konev led the first Ukrainian front from the south. Together, they commanded 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 41,600 artillery guns, and 7,000 aircraft, the greatest concentration of military strength ever aimed at one city. Stalin had already chosen the date, April 16th, just 16 days away. The real question isn't what Stalin would have said if the Western Allies reached Berlin first. The question is what he said and did when he thought they might. That fear consumed him completely in spring 1945. The race didn't begin in April, but in March, when the Western Allies did something that shocked their own leaders. On March 7th, American troops from the 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still intact. Its explosives had failed. They crossed the Rhine, Germany's final natural barrier, before German engineers could blow it up. Within days, thousands of Americans flooded across. Within weeks, multiple Allied armies had forced crossings along the entire river. The Western advance moved with stunning speed. British and American forces swept through Germany, meeting fierce resistance in some places but total collapse in others. Some German units battled to their last man. Others gave up by the thousands. Towns fell within hours. Whole regions surrendered within days. By late March, Western spearheads were racing east, sometimes covering 50 kilometers daily. Berlin sat roughly 100 kilometers from the forward American positions. The Soviet front on the Oder was closer, but not by much. And the Western forces moved faster, with shorter supply lines and fresher troops than the Red Army units that had fought continuously since Stalingrad. In Moscow, Stalin studied the maps with mounting dread. He had spent 4 years fighting toward this moment, 4 years of unthinkable sacrifice, 27 million Soviet citizens dead, entire cities turned to ash, the industrial core devastated. His own son had been captured and died in German hands. He remembered German armies reaching Moscow's outskirts in 1941, so close that officers could see the Kremlin through their field glasses. The 900-day siege of Leningrad, the million dead at Stalingrad. After all that blood, after driving the Wehrmacht back 2,000 kilometers from the Volga to the Oder, the Americans and British might simply roll into Berlin ahead of him. The thought was unbearable. Stalin's interpreter, Valentin Berezhkov, later recalled the Soviet leader being extremely agitated in late March. Stalin chain-smoked his pipe, walking the Kremlin halls, demanding updates every few hours on Western positions. He studied intelligence about American tank movements with the same intensity he gave casualty reports. His questions grew sharper, more suspicious. How fast were they advancing? What about their fuel supplies? Had they hit serious resistance? Were they slowing or accelerating? The answers didn't reassure him. On March 28th, Eisenhower sent a message directly to Stalin, skipping normal diplomatic routes. The American general outlined his strategy. He would drive toward Leipzig and Dresden, cutting Germany in two and blocking any Nazi escape to a rumored Alpine fortress in southern Germany. Berlin, Eisenhower explained, was no longer a main target. He would leave it to the Soviets. Stalin read the message several times, hunting for tricks. He summoned Marshal Zhukov. Zhukov had defended Moscow in 1941, led the counterattack at Stalingrad, lifted the Leningrad siege, and pushed the Wehrmacht back across Poland. If anyone could decode Eisenhower's real intentions, it was Zhukov. "What do you think?" Stalin asked, smoke rising from his pipe. Zhukov, according to his later writings, chose his words carefully. The American general's message seemed straightforward. Militarily, Eisenhower's plan made sense. The Western Allies had shorter supply lines. They could reach central Germany faster than Berlin, which sat in a vulnerable position requiring advance along a narrow corridor exposed to counterattacks. Stalin listened, his face blank. Then he asked the question that revealed his real concern. But can we trust them? Silence filled the room. Trust. That was the word that mattered, not military logistics or strategic goals or operational details. Trust. And Stalin trusted nobody. He had signed a peace deal with Hitler in 1939, dividing Poland between them, only to have Hitler attack 2 years later. He had watched the Western Allies delay opening a second front for years while the Soviet Union bled. He had sat through meetings at Tehran and Yalta, smiling and shaking hands with Roosevelt and Churchill while calculating how to secure Soviet control of Eastern Europe. He had built his entire career on the principle that everyone lies, everyone has hidden motives, everyone will betray you given the chance. Why would Eisenhower be different? Stalin's suspicion had a certain logic. He knew Churchill wanted to reach Berlin first. British intelligence reports, intercepted and decoded by Soviet agents, made that clear. Churchill saw the post-war world forming and understood that whoever controlled Berlin would control the symbol of victory. The British Prime Minister urged Eisenhower to drive for the German capital, arguing political factors outweighed military ones. But Eisenhower refused. The American general thought in terms of casualties and supply chains, not post-war influence. He calculated that taking Berlin would cost tens of thousands of American lives. For what? The city had no military value. The German government was already fragmenting. The war was won. Why sacrifice American soldiers for a symbolic prize when the Soviets could pay that price instead? Stalin didn't believe this logic. Couldn't believe it. In his view, no commander would willingly give up such a prize. Therefore, Eisenhower must be deceiving him. The Americans must be planning to race for Berlin while pretending otherwise. The message was a trick designed to make Soviet forces relax while Western tanks rolled toward the German capital. He ordered Zhukov and Konev to speed up their preparations. The original plan called for the Berlin attack to start in late April or early May, after spring mud dried and supplies were stockpiled. Stalin moved the date to April 16th, 12 days after receiving Eisenhower's message, 16 days from when he gave the order. Then he did something that showed just how desperate his fear had made him. He summoned both marshals to Moscow. Zhukov and Konev arrived April 1, 1945, and were immediately called to Stalin's Kremlin office. The Soviet leader stood at a large map table covered with colored pins and pencil marks showing unit locations. The Western Allies are preparing to capture Berlin before us, Stalin announced bluntly. He pointed at the map, showing American positions. Both marshals knew this assessment was questionable at best. Soviet intelligence had found no signs of Western preparations for a Berlin attack. No troop concentrations, no ammunition stockpiling, no bridging equipment movement. But neither marshal contradicted Stalin directly. Instead, Zhukov asked how soon the Soviet attack could begin. "How long do you need?" Stalin countered. Zhukov calculated quickly. His first Belarusian front sat closest to Berlin, positioned directly east across the Oder. But the Germans had heavily fortified the western. Breaking through would need massive artillery preparation, careful timing, overwhelming force. Under normal conditions, he'd want 3 weeks minimum. 16 days, Zhukov said. Stalin turned to Konev. "And you?" Konev commanded the first Ukrainian front to the south, facing less fortified German positions but farther from Berlin. He saw an opportunity. If Zhukov got bogged down in frontal assault, Konev might sweep north and reach Berlin first. "We can be ready in the same time frame," Konev said. Stalin looked at both men, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a thin, cold expression that never touched his eyes. "Good," he said. "Whoever breaks into Berlin first will have the honor of liberating it." The words hung there, Both marshals understood immediately. Stalin wasn't just ordering an attack, he was creating a competition, a race. Zhukov versus Konev, First Belarusian Front versus First Ukrainian Front. Two massive armies driving toward the same target, each trying to beat the other. The rivalry between the commanders was already intense. Zhukov was more famous, the hero of Moscow and Stalingrad, Stalin's favorite when things went well. Konev was equally skilled but less celebrated, resentful of Zhukov's fame, hungry to prove himself. Stalin knew this. He exploited it deliberately. Konev later wrote that he left the Kremlin that day determined to reach Berlin ahead of Zhukov. Zhukov, in his writings, described feeling enormous responsibility, but also fierce determination not to be outpaced by his rival. Stalin had weaponized their ambition. But first, he had to maintain the deception with the West. On March 31, the same day he was orchestrating this internal competition, Stalin sent his reassuring message to Eisenhower. Berlin had lost importance. The attack would come in May, secondary forces only. Every word false. The irony was that Eisenhower was telling the truth. The American general genuinely had no plans to drive for Berlin. His strategy was exactly as described: cut Germany in half, eliminate organized resistance, link up with Soviet forces somewhere in central Germany. Berlin could wait. But Stalin couldn't conceive of an enemy commander willingly surrendering such a prize. His entire understanding of power, politics, and human nature made Eisenhower's honesty incomprehensible. So he assumed deception and responded with deception of his own. The result was a race that only one side knew they were running. Along the Oder, Soviet forces prepared with frantic intensity. Ammunition stockpiles grew hourly. Tank units moved into position under darkness. Artillery pieces, thousands of them, were dug into firing positions pre-aimed at German lines. Bridging equipment came forward. Assault boats were distributed. Combat engineers studied aerial photos of German fortifications, planning routes through minefields. The soldiers knew something massive was coming. The scale of preparation made that obvious. But they didn't know when, and they didn't know they were racing against time. Senior Lieutenant Anatoly Mereshko, serving on Zhukov's staff, later described the atmosphere as electric with tension. Officers worked 18-hour days. Sleep was measured in minutes. Zhukov himself seemed everywhere at once, checking preparations, demanding updates, pushing subordinates to move faster. The marshal's normally rough manner became even harsher. He tolerated no delays, no excuses, no problems. Konev drove his forces equally hard. His staff officers joked grimly that the marshal feared Zhukov reaching Berlin first more than he feared the entire German army. They weren't entirely wrong. On April 16, at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, the Soviet attack began. Zhukov's artillery, massed in concentrations never before seen in warfare, opened fire. 143 searchlights positioned behind Soviet lines suddenly blazed to life, their beams aimed at German positions. The plan was to blind and confuse the defenders while lighting the battlefield for advancing Soviet troops. The effect was apocalyptic. The thunder of artillery could be heard in Berlin, 40 kilometers away. The ground shook continuously. German soldiers in forward positions, those who survived the initial bombardment, described it as the end of the world. Some went insane. Others simply froze, unable to process the scale of destruction being unleashed. But the attack didn't go as planned. German forces on the Silo Heights, the elevated ground west of the Oder, had prepared their defenses with typical German thoroughness. They had created multiple defensive lines, each designed to funnel Soviet attacks into killing zones. They had flooded low-lying areas, creating swamps that tanks couldn't cross. They had positioned anti-tank guns with overlapping fields of fire. They had even calculated the searchlight's effect and instructed their troops to ignore them, focusing instead on sounds of approaching Soviet armor. Zhukov's initial assault stalled. The searchlights, rather than helping, actually backlit Soviet troops, making them easier targets. The flooded ground channeled attacks into predictable paths. German defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the desperation of men defending their capital, their families, their homes. For 3 days, the First Belarusian Front battered itself against the Silo Heights. Casualties mounted horrifically. Entire tank brigades were destroyed. Infantry units suffered 50% losses. Zhukov committed his reserves early, throwing more men and machines into the assault, trying to overwhelm German defenses through sheer mass. To the south, Konev's forces broke through more easily. The terrain was less favorable for defense, the German forces thinner. By April 18th, Konev's tank armies were racing north toward Berlin, threatening to outflank Zhukov's stalled attack and reach the city first. In Moscow, Stalin watched the reports with satisfaction. The competition was working exactly as intended. Both marshals were driving their forces to the limit, accepting massive casualties because neither wanted to lose the race. On April 20, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling Berlin directly. The sound of the guns could be heard throughout the city. Berliners who had survived years of Allied bombing now faced a new terror. The Red Army was coming. Zhukov's forces finally broke through the Silo Heights on April 19. The cost was staggering. Soviet casualties for the first 4 days exceeded 30,000 killed and 90,000 wounded. Tank losses numbered in the thousands. But the breakthrough was complete. German defensive lines collapsed. Soviet armor poured through the gaps, racing toward Berlin. Konev, seeing Zhukov's breakthrough, drove his forces even harder. His tank commanders reported fuel shortages. Konev ordered them to keep moving anyway, promising fuel would catch up. His infantry reported exhaustion. Konev ordered them to march through the night. Every hour mattered. Every kilometer counted. The race was now visible to everyone involved. On April 21, Soviet forces reached Berlin's outskirts. The battle for the city began in earnest. It would last 12 days and claim more than 300,000 Soviet casualties, killed and wounded combined. German losses were never accurately counted, but certainly exceeded those numbers when civilian deaths were included. The fighting was unlike anything before in the war. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing zone. German defenders used the city's architecture expertly, turning ruins into defensive positions, firing from basements and upper floors simultaneously, creating crossfires that devastated Soviet advances. Soviet forces responded with overwhelming firepower, using artillery and tanks at point-blank range, reducing entire blocks to rubble to eliminate single machine gun positions. Private Vasily Grossman, serving as a war correspondent with the advancing Soviet forces, wrote in his notebook, "The city is burning. The smoke is so thick you cannot see the sun. Everywhere the smell of corpses and gunpowder. German civilians emerge from cellars with white flags, their faces gray with shock. Our soldiers show them no mercy. 4 years of war have burned away all pity." Stalin received hourly updates on the battle's progress, which units had reached which streets, which bridges were captured, which districts were cleared. He paid particular attention to the race between Zhukov and Konev, asking repeatedly who was closer to the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. On April 25, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, 100 kilometers southwest of Berlin. The meeting was friendly, almost festive. American and Soviet soldiers shook hands, exchanged gifts, posed for photographs. They had come from opposite ends of Europe and met in the middle, cutting Germany in half. But Berlin still fought. The Western Allies were not coming. Eisenhower's message had been truthful. American and British forces held their positions along the Elbe, consolidating gains, accepting surrenders from German units fleeing westward to escape Soviet capture. They made no move toward Berlin. Stalin's fear had been groundless. The race he had created, the competition he had orchestrated, the massive casualties his forces suffered in the rushed attack, all of it had been unnecessary. But Stalin would never admit this, perhaps not even to himself. On April 30, Soviet forces stormed the Reichstag. Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Junior Sergeant Melitin Kantaria carried a Soviet banner to the building's roof and raised it over the ruins. The photograph of that moment, taken slightly later and carefully staged, became one of the most iconic images of the war. 2 days later, on May 2nd, the Berlin garrison surrendered. General Helmuth Weidling, the city's defender, signed the capitulation. The battle was over. The Red Army had taken Berlin. Stalin had won his race against an opponent who wasn't running. The cost was almost incomprehensible. Soviet forces suffered approximately 80,000 killed and 275,000 wounded in the Berlin operation. German military and civilian deaths combined exceeded those numbers significantly. The city itself was devastated beyond recognition. Roughly 1.5 million Soviet artillery shells had been fired during the battle. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. The civilian population, those who survived, faced mass violence from Soviet soldiers seeking revenge for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. Grossman, walking through the conquered city, wrote, "The women tell terrible stories. They do not look at our soldiers. The children are silent, watching everything with enormous eyes. I feel ashamed, but I do not know what to do about it." In Moscow, Stalin received news of Berlin's fall with quiet satisfaction. He had achieved what he set out to achieve. The Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. The Red Army had captured Hitler's capital. The symbolic victory was complete. But what did Stalin actually say when he learned the Western Allies would reach Berlin first? He said nothing, because it never happened. What Stalin said and did when he feared they might reveals far more about the man and the system he built. He lied to his allies. He created a competition between his own commanders that cost tens of thousands of lives. He rushed an attack that could have been conducted more carefully with fewer casualties, because he couldn't conceive of an enemy telling the truth. His worldview, shaped by decades of suspicion and political violence, made cooperation impossible and trust incomprehensible. He assumed everyone operated as he did, through deception, manipulation, and ruthless pursuit of advantage. When confronted with an enemy commander who simply told him the truth, Stalin's response was to disbelieve it and act on his suspicions. The tragedy is that Stalin was wrong. Eisenhower wasn't deceiving him. The Western Allies weren't racing for Berlin. Churchill wanted to, but the American general refused, and American forces dominated the Western Allied command structure. The race existed only in Stalin's imagination, created by his inability to trust anyone, even when they were being honest. But Stalin's imaginary race had real consequences. Real soldiers died because of it. Real families were destroyed. A real city was devastated. The human cost of Stalin's paranoia was measured in hundreds of thousands of casualties and immeasurable suffering. Zhukov, in his writings published years later, reflected on the Berlin operation with mixed feelings. Pride in the victory, certainly. The Red Army had accomplished something extraordinary. But also questions about whether it had been necessary to move so fast, to accept such high casualties, to rush the attack when a more deliberate approach might have achieved the same result with less bloodshed. He never directly criticized Stalin's decision. That would have been dangerous even years after Stalin's death. But the questions were there, implicit in his account. Konev never expressed such doubts publicly. He had reached Berlin, though not first. He had competed as ordered. He had driven his forces to the limit. In the Soviet system, that was what mattered. Questions about whether the race should have happened at all were not asked. The soldiers who fought in Berlin, those who survived, carried different memories. Some felt pride in the victory, satisfaction in avenging the suffering Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. Others felt only exhaustion and desire to forget. Still others felt shame at what had been done to German civilians, though they rarely spoke of it. Private Ivan Konev, no relation to the marshal, later told an interviewer, "We were told we were liberating Berlin. But when I look back, I do not know what we liberated it from or what we liberated it for. We destroyed it. That is what we did. We destroyed it completely." In the decades after the war, the Soviet Union celebrated the capture of Berlin as the culminating achievement of the Great Patriotic War. Victory Day, May 9th, became the most important holiday in the Soviet calendar. The story was told and retold. The heroic Red Army, having defeated the Nazi invaders, marched to Berlin and raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, achieving final victory. What was not told, what could not be told in the Soviet Union, was the story of why the attack happened when it did. Why Stalin rushed the assault. Why he created a competition between his own commanders. Why he lied to his Western allies while fearing they were lying to him. That story revealed too much about Stalin's character, about the nature of the Soviet system, about the human cost of suspicion and distrust. The truth was simpler and sadder than the heroic story. Stalin feared the Western allies would reach Berlin first. That fear, baseless but consuming, drove him to actions that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. When the fear proved groundless, when the Americans and British made no move toward Berlin, Stalin said nothing. He accepted the victory, took credit for the triumph, and never acknowledged that the race had been unnecessary. But Stalin said when he learned the Western allies would reach Berlin first was nothing, because he never learned it, because it never happened. What Stalin said when he feared they might was a lie to Eisenhower and an order to his marshals that set in motion one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The difference between those two statements, the thing that didn't happen and the thing that did, is the difference between Stalin's imagination and reality. And in Stalin's world, imagination was often more powerful than reality, more dangerous than any enemy, more costly than any defeat. Berlin fell to the Red Army on May 2, 1945. The victory was real. The suffering was real. The casualties were real. The race that caused them existed only in Stalin's mind.